Welcome to The Faithful Citizen. I'm Ellison Keller. What happens when a woman in a high-control marriage is doing everything perfectly right, yet quietly and invisibly drowning on the inside? We're breaking new ground today and have a lot to cover. Let's get right into it.
Yeah. Welcome to the space where conviction meets rhythm, where truth got a mic and the church gotta listen. This ain't Sunday talk, it's real life living. Faith in motion, the citizen's mission. We talk grace, we talk justice, we talk peace. Not the kind that conforms, but the kind that frees. The world's loud with noise, we cut through the vision. This is the faithful citizen, let's get to the wisdom.
As we've been exploring the sterile, utilitarian architecture of extreme patriarchy, it's become exceedingly clear that women aren't seen as true co-heirs to the kingdom of God. When we strip away the theological romanticism and floral metaphors so often draped over complementarian marriage sermons, the reality is far more clinical, cold, and transactional. Within these high-control systems, wives are often reduced to spiritualized appliances. They're mechanisms of the home, evaluated entirely by their output. As long as the inputs, the relentless daily demands of the household, reliably produce the expected outputs, hot meals, folded laundry, compliant childcare, and available sex, the machines are deemed to be in perfect working order. But let's take a moment to consider the woman who's quietly, invisibly drowning, suffocating under the crushing weight of an unequal partnership and a theology that demands her endless, unreciprocated self-emptying. She recognizes she's going under and gathers the courage to ask for help, begs for a fair division of the invisible mental load, and even gently suggests couples counseling. She even tearfully confesses her profound, paralyzing depression and exhaustion. But she makes a strategic, deeply conditioned mistake. She continues to function. Because she's terrified of failing her family, her community, and her God, she still manages to get the Sunday meal on the table. The children are bathed, the household calendar is flawlessly managed, and she smiles in the church pew on Sunday morning. To her husband and her pastoral leadership, her desperate pleas for help are rendered null and void by her ongoing productivity. Her distress is categorized as mere complaining, like the predictable, ignorable hum of a working refrigerator. It simply doesn't matter if she's drowning beneath the surface. As long as she continues to fulfill her wifely duties and operate as a functional wife appliance, her psychological and emotional agony is minimized, dismissed, or silenced entirely. This is the tragedy of the functioning woman. The patriarchal church doesn't measure a woman's spiritual, mental, or emotional health by her internal flourishing. It measures it strictly by her domestic utility. Her pain is only legible to the system when it stops being useful. Today, we're going to examine the dark, systemic mechanics of this commodification. We'll explore how young women in conservative religious spaces are psychologically conditioned for limitless endurance, taught from infancy to view their own burnout as holy martyrdom. We'll expose the deafening silence of the church toward the functional sufferer, exploring how the patriarchal system remains willfully oblivious to her pain as long as her labor continues. Finally, we'll confront the terrifying reality of what happens when the human body inevitably breaks down. We'll examine how a husband and his church respond to a woman's pain only when it actively disrupts male comfort, ultimately weaponizing the very concept of clinical therapy not to heal a suffering human soul, but to fix the broken machine and force her back onto the assembly line. Before we can begin to comprehend the sheer magnitude of a functioning woman's endurance, we must first examine the assembly line that built her. The staggering capacity that a wife has to continue producing while internally drowning is the result of decades of meticulous, systemic conditioning and not a biological accident. In conservative religious spaces, girls are trained from infancy that their highest virtues are boundless accommodation, perpetual helpfulness, and absolute self-erasure. While young boys in these ecosystems are typically socialized to conquer, question, and lead, young girls are handed a vastly different spiritual curriculum. They're taught to anticipate, soothe, and absorb the emotional friction of everyone around them. This conditioning operates on a deeply psychological level. A good Christian girl learns early that her inherent worth is directly tethered to her utility. She's praised when she's quiet, rewarded when she's helpful, and celebrated when she demands nothing for herself. If she's not actively serving, organizing, or yielding, she's implicitly taught that she's taking up unauthorized space. Over time, her developing nervous system wires itself to believe that setting a boundary is a sin, and prioritizing her own mental or physical health is a dangerous act of rebellion. She's manufactured for compliance. When this girl becomes a woman and enters into a complementarian marriage, she's thrust into a system that seamlessly weaponizes passages from the Bible to mandate her exhaustion. The patriarchal church possesses a horrifying ability to spiritualize female burnout. We witness this most clearly in the relentless, out-of-context deployment of the Proverbs 31 woman. Originally written as an acrostic poem, a vibrant, celebratory song of a formidable woman of valor, the patriarchal machine has flattened this text into an impossible, grinding daily checklist. To them, it's the user manual for the wife appliance, and not a poem of praise. Under this heavy theological machinery, a woman is taught that pain, chronic fatigue, and mental overload aren't legitimate distress signals from a human body under severe duress. Instead, she's told they're the holy badges of biblical martyrdom. Her suffering is framed not as a warning sign, but as her divine design. When her mind begins to fracture under the impossible weight of an unequal domestic partnership, and when her nervous system screams for rest, the institution doesn't offer her a lifeline or demand that her husband step up to share the load. Instead, it tells her to pray for more stamina. It tells her to find her joy in serving, baptizing her clinical depression as a simple lack of contentment. This transactional framework stands in direct opposition to actual mature Christian flourishing. True, healthy approaches to spiritual formation, often categorized clinically as eudaimonic well-being, emphasize profound self-awareness and the cultivation of relational virtues as essential components of holistic self-development. True spiritual maturity requires an environment where a person can safely explore their internal world, set healthy boundaries, and grow in mutual, reciprocal relationships. Extreme complementarianism actively subverts this eudaimonic growth by replacing the pursuit of deep relational intimacy and self-awareness with a cold metric of domestic output, demanding that the wife sacrifice her holistic flourishing to endlessly serve the individualistic, hedonic comfort of her husband. This brings us to what's arguably the most insidious mechanism of the entire system, the psychological trap of competence. Because she's been rigorously conditioned since childhood to never drop the ball, the drowning woman becomes trapped in her own ability to survive. When the crushing weight of the invisible mental load finally becomes too much, she'll inevitably attempt to articulate her despair. She'll sit across from her husband, or perhaps a pastoral counselor, and use her words. She'll say, "I'm drowning. I need help. I can't carry this mental and emotional load anymore." Offering a clear verbal distress signal, expecting empathy and a structural change in the marriage. Instead, she's met with a crushing cognitive dissonance. Her husband and her church community will look at her clean house, her politely dressed children, and her steady, reliable output, and use her competence as empirical evidence against her pain. They'll point to the folded laundry and the hot meals as proof that her pleas for help are exaggerated. How can she be drowning if the schedule is perfectly managed? How can she be in crisis if she's still showing up to Sunday service with a smile? Because the patriarchal system views her as an appliance, it can't comprehend that the machine might be glitching internally while still maintaining an acceptable degree of output. The husband, comfortable in his privilege and deeply reliant on her invisible labor, points to her ongoing productivity as an excuse to remain willfully oblivious to her distress. He doesn't have to engage with her pain because her pain has yet to inconvenience him. The system demands she endure and then uses that very endurance to invalidate her suffering. The profound tragedy is that, more often than not, the woman does keep going. driven by a deeply ingrained, conditioned terror that if she stops functioning, she'll lose her community, identity, and God, she continues to operate on the assembly line of compliance, absorbing the silence of her husband, swallowing her despair, and returning to her chores, functioning flawlessly on the outside while quietly shattering on the inside. After examining the assembly line, we must now turn our attention to the metric by which the patriarchal church defines a successful marriage to grasp the tragedy of the functioning sufferer fully. In a healthy, mutually submitted partnership, success is measured by profound intimacy, the beautiful, deep, reciprocal work of knowing and being known, marked by emotional safety, shared burdens, and a mutual commitment to the holistic flourishing of both individuals. But within the architecture of extreme complementarianism, the metric of a godly marriage is astonishingly shallow. The presence of mutual intimacy doesn't define success. It's defined almost entirely by the absence of visible friction. In this ecosystem, a quiet, productive wife equates to a holy home. If the household is running smoothly, if the children are presentable, and if the husband is unbothered by domestic chaos, the marriage is heralded as a triumph of biblical headship. The patriarchal system operates on a crushing deficit model. As long as the wife isn't visibly failing in her output, her internal reality is completely irrelevant. The church doesn't bother to look at a silent, endlessly laboring woman and ask, "Is she thriving?" It looks at her and concludes, "She's working." And for a system built on male supremacy, a working machine is a perfect machine. This utilitarian metric provides the perfect cover for a husband to ignore the crushing, invisible weight his wife is carrying, a weight clinically and culturally recognized as the mental load. The mental load is the exhausting, relentless cognitive architecture required to run a family, and not merely the physical execution of chores. It's the constant running inventory of what the household needs. It's anticipating the emotional climates of the children, tracking family appointments, managing extended family relationships, remembering grocery lists, and absorbing the ambient anxiety of keeping everyone else's life moving forward. Because the mental load is invisible, it leaves no physical footprint until it fails. And because it leaves no physical footprint, husbands in patriarchal systems routinely and often willfully dismiss it. These men are the prime beneficiaries of an ecosystem designed to shield them from the friction of domestic and emotional management. They're allowed to clock out of their jobs and return to a home where their wives have perfectly regulated the atmospheric pressure. When a wife attempts to explain this invisible burden, when she tearfully tries to quantify the exhaustion of carrying the psychological weight of the entire family, she's often met with blank stares, defensiveness, or patronizing logic. "If you wanted me to do the dishes, you should have just asked," he'll say, completely missing the reality that having to delegate and manage his participation explicitly is just another exhausting task added to her mental load. This dynamic reveals a chilling truth about the patriarchal husband. His obliviousness is a luxury. He can afford to be deaf to her pleas for help because her pain hasn't yet breached the walls of his comfort. He adopts the psychological posture of existential defensiveness, a mechanism in which he represses his own anxieties by clinging to a rigid belief in a God-ordained, perfectly controlled hierarchy. Acknowledging her drowning would require him to admit his hierarchy is actually crushing her. It would require him to step down from the summit of his unearned authority, dismantle his privilege, and engage in the messy, humbling work of actual partnership. For him, it's far easier to remain oblivious. The result of this willful ignorance is a profound, echoing isolation for the functioning sufferer. There's a specific, suffocating loneliness unique to the woman who's doing everything right while quietly dying inside. She's screaming into a void, but the orderly house and tidy children provide the right level of insulation for the void not to echo back. She sits across from her husband at the dinner table she prepared, eating the food she bought, in the home she endlessly manages, and realizes she's utterly alone, a ghost haunting her own marriage. She's communicated her despair clearly, asked for couples counseling, confessed to the dark, creeping edges of burnout and depression, but because she didn't stop serving the meal, he stepped right over her drowning soul to eat it. The cruelty of this silence can't be overstated. When a woman tells her husband and her church that she's suffocating, and their response is to praise her for her endurance while continuing to consume her labor, they're sending a clear, dehumanizing message. They're telling her that her utility is more valuable than her humanity, and demonstrating that so long as the output is deemed acceptable, it simply doesn't matter if the appliance is overheating. She learns the darkest lesson of the patriarchal covenant. Her husband doesn't love her. He loves what she provides for him. He loves the friction-free life her endless sacrifice affords him. He loves the illusion of his own successful headship, an illusion purchased entirely with the currency of her invisible exhaustion. And so, the functioning woman is left with a terrifying realization. If her words aren't enough to make them care, and her tears aren't enough to force a change, the system will only ever respond to one thing. It won't respond to a suffering human being, but it'll react to a broken machine. Her pain will only be legitimized when the assembly line comes to a violent, grinding halt. There's a fundamental biological limit to human endurance, and though the patriarchal system may treat a woman as a spiritualized appliance, her nervous system remains stubbornly, beautifully human. For years, she may have successfully overridden her body's natural distress signals, swallowing panic attacks, pushing through chronic fatigue, and silencing the depressive fog, all to keep the household running and maintain the illusion of a successful, compliant marriage. But trauma, exhaustion, and profound emotional neglect are cumulative. They keep a meticulous, unforgiving score. Eventually, the sheer crushing weight of the mental and physical load outpaces her capacity to compensate. The breaking point arrives, yet it rarely looks like a dramatic, cinematic rebellion, nor does it typically feature a grand, explosive exit. More often, it looks like a quiet, devastating systems collapse. The body and the mind, pushed entirely outside their window of tolerance for years, initiate an emergency shutdown to survive. The functioning sufferer simply ceases to function. The meticulous calendar slips. The laundry piles up in the corner of the bedroom. The Sunday meal is replaced by whatever can be scavenged from the pantry or by nothing at all. She stops buffering the children's emotional climates, and perhaps most noticeably to the patriarchal system, she stops having sex. Her body, drained of all relational safety and starved of emotional reciprocity, biologically rejects the demand for physical intimacy with a man who consumes her labor but ignores her soul. The assembly line of compliance grinds to a halt. In the deafening silence of this malfunction, a jarring shift occurs within the home. The husband, who for years possessed a superhuman capacity to ignore her weeping, her clear requests for help, and her verbalized despair, suddenly becomes highly alarmed. He's activated and finally paying attention, but we must be unapologetically honest about the root of his sudden alarm. He's not panicking because he's experienced a sudden, miraculous influx of empathy for his wife's emotional state. He's panicking because his personal ecosystem has been disrupted. The frictionless, perfectly regulated environment he's enjoyed throughout their marriage, an environment purchased entirely with the currency of her invisible labor, has abruptly vanished. The husband is forced to confront the reality that his life requires management. He has to navigate his own schedule, source his own meals, and face the daily friction of existence that his wife previously absorbed on his behalf. The sudden absence of her output is a direct, immediate threat to his comfort. For the patriarchal man who relies on the smooth operation of his home to validate his unearned authority, soothe his existential defensiveness, and protect his ego, this disruption is intolerable. He didn't notice her drowning because it didn't require him to change his routine. He only notices her shutdown because it inconveniences him. His panic is fundamentally narcissistic. It's not rooted in the question, what's happening to the woman I love, but rather in what's going to happen to my life now that she's stopped serving it. It's in this precise moment that the functioning woman experiences the most profound and cruel irony of the patriarchal trap. She's finally being taken seriously. Her distress is finally the center of her husband's attention, and often that of the church leadership. But sadly, she's taken seriously for entirely the wrong reasons. Because the system operates on a utilitarian metric, The crisis is fundamentally redefined. The emergency isn't defined clinically or relationally as my wife's in deep, agonizing pain and our marriage is structurally abusive. Instead, it's defined as my wife's no longer serving my needs. Within the ecosystem of extreme complementarianism, she's no longer seen as failing herself or succumbing to exhaustion. She's seen as failing him. The narrative is swiftly and aggressively rewritten, categorizing her physiological and psychological collapse as a spiritual defect, a sudden onset of rebellion, or a failure of biblical submission, and not the tragic, inevitable result of an inhumane system. The husband marshals his concern to diagnose a broken machine, not to comfort a suffering human being. The church echoes this redefinition, often deploying terms like straying from her design or giving a foothold to the enemy to pathologize a perfectly normal human reaction to chronic oppression. She's officially transitioned from a functioning wife appliance to a malfunctioning one. The husband's sudden willingness to engage, to ask questions, and even to suggest the counseling he previously dismissed is a pursuit of his own restored comfort, and not a genuine pursuit of her heart. He wants the machine fixed. He needs the domestic dispenser to work again so he can return to the mountaintop of his unbothered hierarchy. The church rallies around him, offering prayers, casseroles, and pastoral support for the trial he's enduring, centering his inconvenience while utterly erasing her devastation. The ultimate tragedy of the malfunction is that the woman is finally seen, but only as a liability, a glitch in the patriarchal matrix that must be swiftly and urgently repaired so output can resume. When the breakdown is complete and the functioning sufferer has finally ground to a halt, the husband often does something that, for a fleeting, fragile moment, feels like a miracle. He agrees to get help, finally speaking the word she's been desperately begging to hear for years, the word he previously dismissed with a wave of his hand: counseling. For the drowning woman, this concession feels like a life raft. A rush of profound hope floods her exhausted nervous system. She believes, perhaps for the first time in a decade, that he finally sees her. She believes he's finally ready to engage in the hard, humbling work of mutual repair. But this is the devastating Trojan horse of patriarchal intervention. Again, we must make no apologies for exposing what's actually happening when a husband in a high-control system suddenly agrees to therapy after his wife's domestic output stops. He's not walking into a therapist's office to dismantle his unearned privilege, nor is he there to examine his own passive abuse, repent of his willful blindness, or heal the deep structural rot of his marriage. He's taking the appliance to the repair shop because he fails to view his wife as a struggling, autonomous human being and, instead, sees her as an extension of his own comfort. He views the therapeutic space through the same utilitarian lens. He expects the therapist to act as a mechanic. He brings the machine in, points at the stalled assembly line, and asks the professional to diagnose the glitch, tighten the bolts, and get the appliance producing again as quickly and cheaply as possible. In legitimate, trauma-informed clinical psychology, a trained therapist looks at a systemic breakdown and immediately examines the environment. A good clinician understands that if a flower is wilting, you don't pathologize the flower. You examine the soil, the sunlight, and the water. But in the patriarchal church, couples are almost always aggressively steered away from licensed clinical professionals. The system inherently distrusts secular psychology because it demands boundaries, mutual respect, and the dismantling of coercive control. Instead, the couple is funneled into the unregulated, highly dangerous world of biblical counseling. This is where pastoral malpractice thrives. Biblical counseling, particularly within extreme complementarian circles, is frequently conducted by untrained men who lack any legitimate understanding of human psychology, trauma, or the nervous system. They're armed not with clinical expertise, but with a weaponized, cherry-picked theology of male headship. When the couple sits on the pastoral counselor's couch, the husband's profound, years-long emotional neglect is entirely bypassed. The structural inequality of the marriage is never questioned, because the system believes that God ordains inequality. Instead, the counseling session swiftly devolves into an interrogation of the wife's compliance. The patriarchal pastoral counselor isn't a healer, he's an enforcer for the assembly line. He listens to the wife describe her crushing depression, her chronic fatigue, and her total loss of self, and reframes every symptom as a spiritual failure. Her depression is rebranded as the sin of ingratitude. Her physical exhaustion is framed as a failure to trust God's design. Her refusal to have sex with a man who consumes her labor while ignoring her soul is categorized as a dangerous rebellion that's giving Satan a foothold in the marriage. The Bible is used as a wrench to tighten the grip of her subjugation. She went looking for a life raft, and instead, the church handed her an anchor. To better understand the full psychological cruelty of this dynamic, we turn to a concept from family systems theory known as the identified patient. In a highly dysfunctional or abusive family system, the group unconsciously singles out one person to bear the symptoms of the entire group's pathology. The family points at this person and says, "She's the problem. If she would just get better, everything would be fine." This allows the rest of the system to entirely avoid taking responsibility for its own toxicity. The patriarchal marriage weaponizes the concept of the identified patient with terrifying precision. When the wife breaks down, the husband and the church collude to pathologize her. They isolate her entirely normal biological reaction to an inhumane environment and frame it as a defect that resides solely within her. They define her exhaustion as a mental health crisis, a hormonal imbalance, or a spiritual defect that belongs entirely to her. They might even agree to secular therapy or psychiatric medication, but only under the strict underlying condition that she's the broken one. The husband adopts the posture of a long-suffering, patient saint who's gracefully enduring his wife's mental health journey. He doesn't attend the sessions as a co-contributor to the marital collapse, but as a concerned spectator waiting for the doctor to fix his wife. The ultimate devastating goal of this weaponized therapy isn't to heal the woman's soul. It's not to change the suffocating environment, demand equity, or call the husband to repentance. The goal is to medicate, pray away, or counsel away the symptoms of her oppression so she can once again tolerate the intolerable. The system wants to numb her just enough to stop her weeping, complaining, and get her back to doing her expected duties. In no way are they trying to save her life. They're trying to save the machine. And until she recognizes that the couch she's sitting on is just another mechanism of the assembly line, she'll forever be told her desperate, gasping need for air is a symptom of a disease, rather than the completely rational response of a woman who's being held underwater. The woman reading this, suspended in the terrifying, quiet wreckage of her own malfunction, needs to hear this truth with absolute clarity. Her breakdown was never a failure of her faith. It was never a lapse in her spiritual discipline, a lack of biblical submission, or a sinful rebellion against God's design. Her collapse was a profound, holy rejection of an inhumane system. For years, she was conditioned to believe her seemingly limitless endurance was the ultimate measure of her godliness. But when her body and mind finally staged a total system shutdown, they were not betraying her. They were performing a brilliant, desperate biological intervention to save her life. Her nervous system pulled the emergency stop on the assembly line because it was going to kill her. We must never pathologize the body for refusing to breathe underwater, and we must never pathologize a woman's soul for refusing to survive any longer without oxygen. Women must fiercely reclaim the right to exist entirely outside the metric of their own utility. They don't have to earn their rest by collapsing, nor do they have to prove their pain by malfunctioning. A woman's worth, her desperate need for rest, and her absolute right to be heard must never require a total systemic breakdown. Her pain is completely valid even when the laundry is perfectly folded. Her exhaustion is real and worthy of care even when the Sunday meal makes it to the table on time. She's a human being, a co-heir to the kingdom, and a formidable easer, not a household appliance designed to dispense frictionless comfort until the motor inevitably burns out. When the patriarchal machine inevitably tries to push a woman onto the pastoral counselor's couch, when they attempt to pathologize her survival instincts, medicate her righteous anger, and tighten the bolts of her subjugation, she's allowed to stand up and walk out of the repair shop. She doesn't have to participate in the weaponization of her own healing. She's allowed to unplug the machine. She's allowed to step off the assembly line and flatly refuse to manufacture another ounce of unreciprocated peace for a system that consumes her labor while ignoring her soul. It's time to step out of the appliance showroom and into the vast open expanse of the wilderness. The Empire has spent her entire life warning her that the wilderness is a barren, godless exile where rebellious women go to suffer. They lied. The wilderness is a sanctuary, and the only place wide and safe enough for her to reclaim her humanity. Out here, she's allowed to exist simply because she breathes. Out here, the true Christ doesn't meet her with a crushing checklist of wifely duties, but with profound restorative rest. The system will consume women until there's nothing left if they let it, so let it starve. Step out of the cage. The wilderness is waiting, and out here women are finally allowed just to live. As we bring this series to a close, it's necessary to express my deepest gratitude. The work of deconstructing broken systems and advocating for truth is never done in a vacuum. I'm standing on the shoulders of the incredible women who raised me, taught me, and shaped my spiritual and emotional formation. To my mother, sisters, and dear friends, thank you for your indelible impact on my life and for helping shape the man I've become. I must also extend a very special thanks to my wife. She's not only a brilliant clinical psychologist whose expertise and piercing insight have been the driving force behind this entire series, but she's also a truly incredible mother to our two sons. She's helped shape, refine, and ground this work every step of the way. My wife has consistently embodied the true, formidable blessing of the Ezer Kenegdo. She's a rescuing warrior ally in every sense of the word, an equal partner whose strength has challenged and strengthened my own. I simply wouldn't be the person I am today if it weren't for her, and the many incredible women who've played such pivotal roles throughout my life. To all the women listening, reading, and engaging, thank you for your courage, intellect, and enduring strength. Keep stepping out into the wilderness. The world is desperate for your true voice. To everyone tuning in, thank you for walking through the wilderness with me today. If this episode resonated with you, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. The conversation doesn't end here. Join us on Threads and head over to our Substack to read the full essay and share your voice. I'm Ellison Keller, and this has been The Faithful Citizen.